79%, according to at least one exit poll, of American Jews voted for Harris. What do you make of that?
I'm going to get in so much trouble for this conversation.
It's very interesting.
Everything they threw at Trump failed.
How did Trump defeat the vast majority of the American establishment?
It's elites versus the working class. And in my book, Second Class, I traveled the country and I interviewed working class Americans of all political persuasions. And guess what, Winston? They agreed on 98% of the issues.
Do you think that the working people of America who don't like the war in Ukraine feel the same way about the war in Israel?
No, I know that they don't.
What's the difference?
The difference is success in journalism today is measured in terms of engagement, and the most angry readers are the most engaged. All of the anti-Semitism is coming from the elites. They've lost the ability to tell the American people what to think, and that is a wonderful thing.
Well, if you want to support the show, all you have to do is press subscribe. You press subscribe. I'm going to have more phenomenal guests like Batya exploring the issues that you want to hear about and the mainstream media won't touch. But without further ado, Batya Ungar-Sargon. Batya Ungar-Sargon, thank you so much for finally coming to speak to me. I say finally because we've been talking about doing something for a long time, and I'm grateful that you've taken time out of your busy schedule to sit down and discuss the election with me.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So it was quite a victory for Donald Trump. Not only did he win the White House, he won the Senate, he won the House of Representatives, he won the popular vote. He also now has majority of state, Republicans have a majority of state governors, state legislators, and don't forget, they have the Supreme Court. It's an unbelievable mandate and quite unprecedented. To boot, Kamala Harris, she had $1.4 billion behind her, double what Trump had. She had 83 billionaires behind her. She had all of Hollywood. She had all of the celebrities, music industry. She even had she had all of the mainstream media, which you've written a whole book about, which I look forward to discussing in this conversation. She had most of big tech, and she still lost. Love to know your initial thoughts on the results.
It's so funny because when you say it like that, it's like the Passover song Dayenu, like it would have been enough if he had just won. But he won while she had the backing of all of the deplorables in this country, right?
Yeah.
Like the billionaire class and the Hollywood class and the elites from every different corner. Goldman Sachs, Liz Cheney, the warmongers, everybody who sold out the working class was behind her. And so it was like the victory was compounded by the fact that there was a real sense of justice, of course, correction. Everything they threw at Trump failed. And I'm glad you brought up the money. I think that's one of the most underreported parts of this election. She outraised and outspent him by millions and millions and millions of dollars. And the same thing happened in the Republican primary. Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis both outspent Donald Trump. The billionaire class, the donor class of the Republican Party, just like the donor class of the Democratic Party, lined up to defeat Donald Trump. And failed because the American electorate had its say and American democracy is alive and kicking. And it doesn't matter how much you spend trying to fool the American people. They know what's in their best interests. This election was about the class divide, which I've written 2 books about at this point.
2 fantastic books, which I highly recommend to listeners. Second Class, How the Elites Have Betrayed America's Working Men and Women. And Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. Well, it seems woke media has undermined the Democrat Party more specifically, but let's get back to that later. On the election, to British viewers. British viewers are completely bemused and mystified by how it is that the working people of America, as you say, voted against the elites in the way that they did. I would say they voted for a new type of elite, but to someone who just doesn't understand America, and which is most of the world, and also half of America, it seems, or maybe a fraction of America, how do you explain the victory? How did Trump defeat the vast majority of the American establishment?
If you don't live in America, and also if you're part of the elites in America, you think that the big divide in America is right versus left, Democrats versus Republicans. If you're part of the leftist elites, you believe it's the racial divide, blacks versus whites. Both of these are totally false. The divide in America is between the college-credentialed elites and the working class. It's between the people who work in the knowledge industry and people who work with their hands for a living. The Democrats over the last 60 years created an economy that was an upward transfer of wealth from the working class to the elites. Now, the top 20% controls over 50% of the GDP. And this was because Democratic economic policy was wage theft of working class people. Immigration is the perfect example of this. The left likes to talk about immigration in moral terms, but actually they think about it in economic terms. They are benefiting from importing millions and millions and millions of low-wage laborers to undercut American workers in the economy and in jobs. They hire illegal immigrants and then they don't have to pay an American a living wage to do that job. So it's the perfect example of something that they love to talk about in this virtue language. We must bring these people here. They are suffering. Let's give them asylum. They are refugees. It's nonsense. These are slaves who have been enslaved by the cartels and brought here on purpose to work for cheap, to bring down working class wages. It's one of those examples that looks like it's left versus right, but it's not. The majority of American working class people, whether they vote for Democrats or Republicans, want much less immigration because they know that these immigrants are making it much harder for them to achieve the American dream. Now, what did the left do when the working class started speaking up about this? They called them racist. They sneered at them. They made it a taboo to discuss this, okay? So this is one example of many examples of how the left used language to act like the divide here was between high-minded human rights ideals, the good versus racism and bad and the right. But it was nonsense. The dividing line on how you feel about whether we should have more or less immigrants is how much money you make, is what industry you work on. Do you work in landscaping? Do you work in construction? Do you work in janitorial services? If you work in those industries, you are making much less money now than you were in the 70s because of all of these immigrants. If you work in the knowledge industry, if you are a programmer, if you are a journalist, if you are a politician, you are making money from having all of this labor here now to work for cheaper than an American. So you see how the divide is not right versus left. It's elites versus the working class. And in my book, Second Class, I traveled the country and I interviewed working class Americans of all political persuasions. And guess what, Winston? They agreed on 98% of the issues, whether they were on economics or on cultural issues. So let's get back to this
98%
election.
of which issues?
All of the issues.
What do you mean, agreeing with who? With each other?
Working class Democrats
agree with
and
each other.
working class Republicans
Okay.
agree on 98% of the issues. They agree on abortion, that it should be legal and rare. They agree on guns, that they should be legal and with many protections. They agree on welfare. They don't like it. They agree on taxes. We should tax the rich more. They agree on healthcare. We should have much more access to affordable healthcare. And they agree on immigration. We should have much less immigration. And interestingly, they agree on LGBTQ issues. So Republican working class people are extremely pro-gay. And Democrat working class people are very worried about the trans agenda. There's no such thing as LGBTQ to working class people. They are deeply tolerant.
What are they worried about? Sorry, the Democrat working class people. What
They're
about
worried
the
about the
LGBT?
transgender agenda coming
Overreach.
into schools. Exactly.
Okay.
They respect any adult's right to do what they want in the privacy of their own home. They want trans people to be protected from discrimination in housing and in the workforce. They absolutely do not want teachers talking to children about sexuality. They don't want their children getting the idea that they can choose what gender they want to be. They don't want to hear this nonsense in schools. They don't want to see trans women beating up biological women in sports. These are views that are shared by the vast majority of Americans. So let's come back to this election. So many people were so shocked by Donald Trump's victory. He didn't just win. He won a mandate by flipping millions of Americans who were Democrats 50 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 2 years ago, and 2 months ago.
Yeah.
Okay? How did he do that? These were working class people. These are Latinos, Black men, working class people who saw in Donald Trump's promises a return to a policy, primarily on the economic front, that really benefited them. Now, if you are a rich person and you held your nose and voted for Trump, there were a lot of people like that, okay? Those people were voting, I think, based on culture war issues. They were voting based on the woke overreach, the trans agenda in schools. They're sick of being called racist by their like slightly more leftist friends on Twitter. If you are a working class person, you didn't vote on that stuff. They don't like that stuff, but that's not what they voted on. They voted because Donald Trump had simply lifted the Democrats' 90s era agenda off of them. So when Trump took over the Republican Party, the Reagan version of the Republican Party had been very different than what Trump made it into. It had three main planks. It was socially conservative. It believed in foreign interventions. It was neoconservative. And it was very pro-free trade, trickle-down economics, free markets, chamber of commerce, pro-corporation. And Trump said no to all of those things. He's not a social conservative. He's a social moderate. He promised to veto a national abortion ban. He thinks abortion should be legal for 12 weeks. And throughout the campaign, he sidelined and humiliated the pro-life right as embodied by the Project 2025 people. They put out this agenda, this very pro-life agenda, and he said, we're not doing any of that, actually.
How did he humiliate them apart from distancing himself from Project 2025?
Well, that was very humiliating. They came out and said, here is the agenda Donald Trump is going to enact. And he was like, actually, we're not going to do any of that.
Yeah, he's always been saying he always believes abortion, his cutouts are for life of the mother, rape and incest. So he's always been very clear about that. And he said he went back to an old Democrat position, which is that it should go back to the state to decide.
Exactly.
Which it's odd then that has become such a big issue, particularly for young women. That seemed to be their biggest issue. Like 30% of young women, Roe v. Wade was the biggest, most important issue. The second most important being economy at like 10 or 11%. So I want to get into the gendered aspect of the election, but just to dig a little deeper on what you just said, an old leftist or maybe a British leftist might listen to what you just said and think, well, already in the few days since Trump was elected, the very richest in America have got even richer. He's only about supporting the very richest. Do you actually believe that he is going to help working people?
Oh, of course. I mean, the number one thing...
Economically.
Number one thing that would help working people would be to close the southern border. The limitless supply of low-wage labor, of slaves, cartel slaves, is the number one threat to American wages because labor, like everything else, adheres to the ironclad law of supply and demand. The more you have of something, the cheaper it is. And the less you have of something, the more expensive it is. Yeah. So that number one, rich people love an open border. That's going to be the big fight. And you're going to see that he's going to keep that promise. They love that open border. Wall Street loves that open border. That's why 75% of hedge fund donations went to Kamala Harris. It's why Biden, for every billionaire that backed Trump, Biden had two. They don't like that closed. So he's definitely going to do that. Tariffs. You think rich people like tariffs? They hate tariffs. They want cheap crap produced by slaves in China. He's going to impose massive tariffs. He already did it with steel and aluminum, and you're going to see him expand those.
Now, tariffs aren't all good. There's trade-offs when it comes to tariffs. It does push up the price of goods for working people. So it might be good for the worker, but it won't necessarily be good for the worker when they have to go to the grocery or to buy the products they need.
Well, first of all, we produce a lot of food here. So the price of energy is actually the number one factor in why groceries are so expensive. Second of all, I think there's a misconception about tariffs. You know, it costs a lot to ship things here, right? So if it's produced by a slave in Xinjiang, the labor costs less, but then you have to get it here, right? So there are additional costs associated with just importing cheap things from other countries that you don't have here in America. But also, things are going to be more expensive for everybody But the people who are struggling the most to pay for essentials are going to be making a lot more money, right? So we're going to be paying more for things. They're going to have more money to afford the things they already are paying too much for. So I just don't buy that at all. And the third thing I would say is, a tariff is a threat that forces a country to come to the table and renegotiate. It's not that they have to 100% be imposed the way that he says them, but first of all, it's a starting place for negotiation.
Yeah, that I think that's the strongest
But
case
also,
for tariffs.
I'll just give you one example of a massive tariff Trump imposed that had zero impact on the cost of things. He slapped a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum from China. And the reason he did that was because the average steel worker in America makes $88,000 a year. And most of these steel mills are in the South. So these are not union jobs. They're in right-to-work states. $88,000 a year. That is a solidly middle wage in the South, middle-class wage in the South. So Trump said, we're going to actually protect these jobs. We're not going to allow just the market to be flooded by Chinese steel and aluminum. He slapped a 25% tariff on it. Every economist said what you just said, which is, oh my God, tariffs, everything's going to become unaffordable. A toaster's going to cost $300. How could we possibly, have an entire industry based on the labor of American workers? And guess what happened? For about 4 months, the price of steel and aluminum went up. And then it went right back to where it had been before the tariffs. You know why? Because we have a very healthy capitalistic society here at home. And there was competition between steel mills, and it completely went back to where it had been before. So it's just a perfect example of how this myth that, we all think, well, it makes sense that tariffs would drive up the prices because American labor is more expensive, which is, of course, the goal, right? We want American labor to be more expensive because we want people to make a living wage. But actually, life doesn't work that way. You have to look at what actually happened. Of course, not a single one of those economists admitted that they had been wrong, but economists, they are measuring the aggregate, right? Their only tool for measuring things seems to be the GDP. So they'll tell you mass immigration raises the GDP. How could you be against it? Well, of course it raises the GDP. It makes rich people much richer.
It's GDP per capita that we should be more interested.
GDP is not equally distributed. Yes, the rich have gotten much richer over the last 60 years because they've been stealing wages from the working class by employing immigrants.
So I want to get into the gender aspect of this election. Before we get there, what do you think Kamala did so wrong? What you just played out seems almost like a clear outline of what Trump maybe got right and why the working people went for him. What were her biggest mistakes?
Well, I think it's one and the same, right?
Right.
He lifted the Democrats' incredibly popular agenda off of them, which was to be anti-war, which is very important to working class people, to create an economy that benefits the working class, and to be a social moderate. Yeah. And she ran around with Liz Cheney, okay? So much for being anti-war, right? She refused to say what the upper limit on an abortion should be. So this is not even social moderate. This is just totally... it's insane. If you can't say what is the upper limit for a choice for an abortion, that's not going to fly with average people.
Can I just pick at the anti-war point?
Sure.
So I think it was Kimmel, it might have been Colbert, who in his late night TV show pointed to this is bad for Ukraine as part of the reasons why Trump's victory is bad. Now, European audiences, and particularly progressive European audiences, might be sympathetic with that position that is a Democrat position. So I wondered if you could explain to those who don't understand the America first when it comes to war's position. What is the frame of mind? What is the opinion of the average person who is anti-war, is more isolationist? Just explaining to someone who's maybe never been to America.
I don't want to call it isolationist because I don't think it is. I think it's the idea that American taxpayers should have the benefit of their tax dollars going to things that benefit them. I think it's a very obvious thing, especially at a time when American working class people are struggling. I will tell you that when I was reporting my book, Second Class, and traveling around the country, I interviewed over 100 working class people. I can't think of a single person who didn't independently, spontaneously, without me asking, say, I just don't understand why we're funding this war in Ukraine. So just from a purely democratic point of view, if the vast majority of Americans feel that way, we should not be funding it, right? Like that's how democracy is supposed to work. When most people want something, you do it. So I'm sorry, Europe, but the American people have not been convinced that this is in our interests. Now, I want to explain why I think they're right about that. And then I want to explain why I think this is good for Ukraine. Okay?
Please.
It's not actually bad for Ukraine. It's good for Ukraine. The reason I don't think this is in our interests is because Russia is not actually an enemy of the United States. And this was the Democrats' position.
Now. It's declared the US one of its great enemies, if I've understood correctly, since the war began, since the war started. Have I got that wrong?
I don't have a memory of that, but I mean, at this point, that would make sense because we've been funding the Ukrainians, right?
Yeah,
but
since the war, yeah.
Before the war began, Russia was not an enemy of the United States, and this was Democratic position. So in 2012, when Barack Obama and Mitt Romney were in a presidential debate and they were asked what is the greatest foreign adversary the United States faces, Mitt Romney said Russia, and Obama basically laughed him off the stage. He said the 80s called, they want their foreign policy back. This was a ridiculous idea. The idea on the Democratic side was, no, Russia and Putin are a potential ally in the fight against our actual greatest adversary, which is obviously China. So that was how the Democrats saw things. And what flipped there is 2016, Donald Trump won, and Hillary Clinton became convinced that Putin was the reason that Donald Trump won. 66% of Democrats believed that Putin had changed the voting tallies to enable Donald Trump to take office. There was a big not stop the steal, but they believed that the election had been stolen. And Hillary Clinton called Donald Trump an illegitimate president and said that he was only president because of Putin. Because of Donald Trump, the Democrats then decided that Russia was the great adversary. They did this 180 to justify their hatred of the American electorate. That's what it was. Donald Trump won in a completely fair election, but they couldn't accept that loss. And so as an alibi for their own failures, they blamed Putin and started to become increasingly, in their language, belligerent. Kamala Harris saying that Ukraine is going to join NATO, Ukraine, the most corrupt country in Europe, that was never going to be on the table. So they became increasingly belligerent. And then, obviously it's Putin's fault. He made the ultimate decision to invade Ukraine. I don't want to take that away, but we certainly did not do all that we could to prevent that from happening. I think that we expected Putin to accept conditions in the near vicinity of his country that we would never have accepted. I mean, if China put nuclear weapons in Mexico, we would wage a full-on war, and we would have done it much faster than Putin did. Again, not to justify the war, but just to say the Democrats never considered Russia to be an adversary until they were able to blame Russia for Donald Trump's victory. So the idea that we should be funding this war because we're fighting our enemy, I think, just does not fly with average Americans. And the third point I would make is just, it is not good for Ukraine for this war to go on. The war is going to end with basically a ratification of the status quo when Putin invaded, which is Crimea, part of Russia, the Donbas, an independent region, and Ukraine, not part of NATO. And meanwhile, over the last 2 years, 500,000 young men are dead. The sooner an end is put to that, the better. And I think that what happened here was just horrific. I mean, a horror. The Democrats, to prosecute a domestic enemy, as they saw it, ended up funding a war at the expense of the American taxpayer that they never justified to American taxpayers, and that resulted in just absolutely massive and atrocious bloodshed. It will be good for Ukraine for this to be over as soon as possible. And if Trump gives them someone to blame for the loss of those territories, I think that he's willing to take that on, which is what a true leader actually does, and says, you know what? Blame me. I'm going to make the decision that's best for my people, for your people, and for your people.
So Trump, one of his campaign promises was that he would end the war before he was inaugurated.
I think that's entirely possible that he will be able to do that.
How's he going to do it?
He has refused to make Putin feel like he is not an objective arbiter here. And there was so much pressure on him. I mean, can't even count the amount of times that a journalist looked at Trump, Mr. President, are you saying you don't want the Ukrainians to win? All of this pressure to see the Ukrainians as some beacon of democracy. And again, I respect their fight for sovereignty. I think they've fought admirably and nobly for what is theirs. I respect that. But I think when Trump refused to denounce the Russians as irredeemable, he created a partner for himself there to ratify the status quo as it was before the war started and to get back to that state. And I think if Russia is willing to accept that and Ukraine is willing to accept that, this could be solved so quickly and not another person has to die for this.
Do you think that the working people of America who don't like the war in Ukraine feel the same way about the war in Israel?
No, I know that they don't.
What's the difference?
The difference is that Israel is actually fighting our enemies, declared enemies of the United States. The United States gets a lot in return for the aid that we give to Israel. That aid is spent here in the domestic market on American weapons. And then the Israelis improve those weapons and give us those improvements. There's intelligence sharing. The Houthis obviously are waging economic warfare on the United States. They've closed off the entire passage of goods through that strait. And I mean, we just accept it like cucks. I mean, it's like so gross. And you see how the Israelis are actually on the front lines against people who have declared themselves the enemies of the United States. Now, that's not to say that I support all of the aid to Israel. I think that Israel has paid a huge cost for getting all of this aid from us instead of developing its own military-industrial complex. I think a lot of Americans feel like, we shouldn't be giving aid to any countries because we have so many problems here at home. I totally respect that view. But the American people are deeply, deeply, deeply philo-Semitic. The average American, working class Americans, they feel a connection to Israel. Christians feel a deep connection to Israel on a spiritual level. The view of this democracy, this flourishing democracy in the Middle East, there's this, cultural continuity between our countries. It's just a very different situation. But, I see why people would say, look, both of those, are outposts of democracy fighting American adversaries. I just think it's true in one case and it's not true in the other case. And even in the case that I think it's true, I'm not sure we should be funding it. I think Israel's a very rich country. And I think that, again, I think they have sacrificed a lot in terms of their own sovereignty by allowing this perception that they're a client state of the United States. And I don't think that's good for Israel.
Can I pick on one detail there?
Yeah, sure.
You just mentioned that you think that, you suggested that they should have developed their own military-industrial complex. Mm-hmm. Now, part of Trump's coalition is a populist feeling, and military-industrial complex is something really the left has been crying out against for many decades in America. Are you pro-military-industrial complex?
I'm definitely pro-Israel being able to fight its enemies and kill terrorists.
Okay. So their own military, you meant? You didn't mean an actual industrial complex used in the sort of derogatory way it's used by populists in America?
Well, I think having strong defense is very important. There's this worship of weakness on the left. They worship weakness. They worship abjection. Like the psychological model of the left is, I have no power, now you do everything I say, right? Which is why they love Hamas, because that's what Hamas does, right? Like, they're like, we have less power, so we can rape your women and murder your babies and get away with it, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's this idea that the less powerful is imbued with inherent virtue and thus has no moral responsibilities. Mm. And I think that I used to think that. I used to be very much of the left.
It's the virtue of the oppressed. It's the ultimate fallacy in progressive thought. Just because you might be perceived as oppressed, that means that you can do no wrong.
Exactly. And I think that, the Democrats like their allies to be weak because they like to order them around. And I think Trump likes to have strong allies because he thinks weakness is lame and he doesn't like being in pictures with lame people.
Right.
So basically, military industrial complex, it's probably in America, we probably go too far. I think probably it does have an impact on our foreign policy in a negative way. But at the same time, you want to be strong. You don't want to be messed with. You have to protect your women. And I think, sometimes humiliating defeat of your enemies is the way you do that. And the left has just they've sacrificed women, like they've sacrificed the vulnerable, the truly vulnerable, on the altar of this idea that abjection itself is the highest virtue and that we should open ourselves up to attacks from other people because those other people are from an oppressed category, embodied by the image of a trans boxer beating a woman in the face. Yeah. That's kind of
the Olympics, yeah. Do you think if it was feasible that Ukraine could have total victory over Russia, that you'd have a different position on that? You would support the war in the same way of supporting the war with Israel?
Yeah, I could see that, yeah, because I believe in sovereignty. It's incredibly important, yeah. But they can't. The
problem is it's actually just not practical. It's just not possible.
It's not practical. It's not possible. And also, I think that the West played a role in forcing this war. I think we did. And we didn't respect Russia's sovereignty, or at least Putin's sense of what it meant to be sovereign, which meant having that buffer in Ukraine where it did have what George Bush called good relations with its neighbors.
Well, personally, I'm a big fan of Trump's foreign policy, and you can just see the state of the world when he was last president and just compare it with what was before and what was after. I hope that it can be a return to that relative peace. And I saw an article in Newsweek yesterday saying that Hamas have already asked and called for peace. Whether how much there is to that will be seen, but it's encouraging, I suppose. I want to come back to the election and the gender divide. This is really interesting to me because, as I said earlier in this conversation, abortion rights, Roe v. Wade, that was so important for young women. And yet, women moved from their support of Biden at 55% in the last election to Kamala is now 53%. She lost 2% of women. And Trump gained 3% of women, up to 46%. It seems like, well, I'll add to that as well. The GOP spent $15 million dollars, on political ads targeting Harris's transgender policy, which you've also mentioned already in this conversation. Not only that, we saw through the whole campaign this totally bizarre male versus female split. Not only do we have the famous J.D. Vance famously saying, childless cat ladies, which obviously pissed off even conservative people. But on the other side, well, and to sort of continue, we had Donald Trump making jokes about cucks. You've brought up cucks already in this conversation, at the Al Smith dinner, saying, have you seen these white guys for Harris? Well, I'm not worried about them because their lovers and their lovers' partners are all voting for me. Elon Musk has been regularly making jokes at the expense of cucks on Twitter. On the other side, you had the Democrat Party. It was openly anti-alpha male. Dana Bash at the DNC said, we've got to appeal to men who have low T, who don't have, aren't testosterone laden, I think was the word she used. And it's not at all a surprise to me that Tampon Timmy was the face of the beta male movement. It wasn't a surprise to me that they picked that. This is a global phenomenon. We have in Britain, we had this young men are going right, young women are going left, although the women going left didn't really happen here in America. It has happened in Germany, it's happened in South Korea. It's almost everywhere. I think Singapore is an anomaly. But I want to get the American vibe on this. Did Kamala back the wrong women's rights issue in hammering the abortion? I mean, she was lying about Trump's position on abortion. She was saying he wants to ban abortion. I mean, that was not ever what he said. Should they have doubled into the transgender thing? How big was the transgender issue, you think, in this election?
I think it was big for elites who flipped. So for suburban people, people who are comfortable, people who are, in the elites, who sort of either held their nose and voted for Trump or voted for Republican for the first time. There are significant amounts of people like that. I think the anti-Semitism on campuses and the transgender issue played a big role. I don't think for the average person this was the motivating factor. There's, the
$215 million to spend from the Republicans spent suggested it's an important factor. Or at least they thought so.
If you watch that video, So the quote that they used, first they said, Kamala's for they, them, Trump is for you, which is very funny. I wouldn't even call that the trans issue because they, them is what someone like Brianna Wu, who's a transsexual, is annoyed at the movement for adopting all of this other crap, right? Like the they, them stuff, right? Which is not about having gender dysphoria, which is a mental illness. It's some other thing about, refusing to conform, etc. Right? Mm-hmm. So I think, first of all, that, but also, in the video that they used of Harris, that was in that ad, she said she supported taxpayer dollars going to the trans surgeries of inmates.
Right.
So there's a bunch of things going on there.
There was something happening in California. Well, yes. Unpack it for us, please.
So, yes, you could say the thing that was offensive about that to so many people was the trans surgery. But honestly, I think the other two pieces were probably much more salient. It was the waste of taxpayer dollars on this ridiculous thing when so many people are suffering. And then...
Do we know how much money?
I don't actually know if anyone actually ever took advantage of this program.
Right.
But it was her saying she supported it, right? Okay. So she supported their tax dollars going to this culture war issue that they really don't identify with. And then the fact that it was prisoners, it was inmates, it was criminals, the people that the Democrats are always siding with, right? So honestly, I think that the trans thing there was less important than the idea that they're taking your tax dollars and siding with criminals against good, God-fearing, law-abiding citizens. I think that was probably equally important. I mean, it was a brilliant ad because it got three really important things in one clip, right? So to me, the woke stuff, what I found in my book was working class people, they're not into the woke stuff. But they just don't have the luxury of voting on that right now. They are really, really struggling with things like paying for housing and healthcare and groceries. And they don't see a future for their children where their children will be better off than they will. So yeah, they don't approve of all of that stuff. But I think that the real reason that Trump saw so many gains was because he was running on a real problem, whereas Harris was running on a fake problem, as you mentioned, a national abortion ban that Donald Trump promised to veto. So what happened was the Democrats came out and berated men, Black men of all people to berate. They berated them, the Obamas berating men.
You're referring to the famous clip of him saying the quote-unquote brothers weren't voting the right way.
And then Michelle Obama coming out and saying, men, you have to support your women because they will be dying on the floor, and sepsis because they can't get an abortion. The reason they used abortion and this made-up abortion ban was because abortion and the fall of Roe v. Wade allowed rich women to feel like they are the true oppressed class in America. We have fewer rights now than we did before. So the Obamas and the Democrats coming out berating men, working class men, struggling men to support women on this fake issue. And what actually ended up happening was working class women turned out and voted for their menfolk, for their husbands, and for their sons, who have really been abandoned by the Democratic Party, by this country, and who saw the first wage increases under Donald Trump that they had seen in 60 years. So I think that is what ended up happening is when you have one candidate running on a fake problem and one candidate running on a real problem, the campaigns gendered those issues, but at the end of the day, the American people knew what was true.
Do you think we can go deeper on that? In that, we've heard now for decades, or certainly the last 10 years, again and again and again, patriarchy, this toxic masculinity, that this wasn't just the Democrat campaign that appeared to me to be anti-male, but the progressive culture is pretty anti-male. Is this the end of that?
Look, you never know what lessons the Democrats are going to learn. The 4 weeks after crushing loss, they allow themselves to say the truth, like even on cable news. So if you turn on MSNBC right now, you will hear people talking about suddenly, Joe Scarborough, he discovered cancel culture and that it's really actually bad. Did you know that they're telling little boys in school that they're toxic? Somebody was talking about immigration the other day, like anti-Semitism. Like, we're in the 4-week period where you can say the true things. You don't know what will stick, though. I mean, this happened in 2016 and nothing stuck. This happened when Glenn Youngkin won and nothing stuck. So you don't really know what lessons will be learned. To me, the real question is, can they learn the lesson on immigration? It's the most important issue. It really unites the cultural and the economic problems of working class people. And it's very hard to imagine them learning the lesson on that because George Soros is one of the main funders. But it's not just him. The entire donor class of the Democratic Party right now is all in on open borders. They don't believe in nation states. They don't believe in, having a strong border. They believe in, this sort of free flow of human populations. And so the party would have to literally say no to its entire donor class, actually the way that Donald Trump did when he was running. And I just don't really see that happening. I mean, the cultural stuff, I think they will probably, I've been saying for 2 years now, we're in the woke lash. Like, the height of 2020, I think you experienced it firsthand. I experienced it firsthand, just like the insane, like life-destroying pushback you would get for saying things that were verboten to be said, like that were really not there anymore.
You think we're in a woke clash, and this is something I've had this conversation with a few people. Are we sure we're in a woke clash? I remember when you and I first met, went for a coffee a couple of years ago around the corner in Soho here in New York, and you said the woke clash, and I was like, it doesn't feel like it when you're in the middle of it, particularly if you're at the brunt of it. But the woke stuff was turbocharged when Trump was last president. Can we really expect that those energies, that spirit that comes from progressives to give up this time? No, I think that it will come back and could very well come back with a vengeance. I mean, they've already started protesting. They've been protesting in Seattle almost immediately after the election results. Can we expect a return of peak woke?
I don't think so.
Why not? What's different this time?
Majority of Hispanic men, 25-30% of Black men. It's just not going to have the same punch. Like, you're going to call me racist for standing with the majority of Hispanic men? I'll take it. It's just not going to have the same. And it's so awful because a lot of people were okay when they were talking this way about white working class men, and it was not okay then. And they only woke up to this when they started talking the same way about Jews, talking the same way about, Hispanics voting for Trump, Black men voting for Trump. It was never okay. But I think now it's easier for people to be courageous and say it is not okay to talk about our fellow Americans this way, because they know that the allegation of racism, which is the worst slur in America, can no longer be accurately applied.
Well, we'll see, I guess. We can only speculate. One last thing on the women's thing. So I know you made the argument that actually working people, they don't actually care about trans. They care about their wallets and the economy. And so it's just annoying to them that's brought up. Having said that, I noticed a lot of working people and a lot of working women unhappy with the encroachment on women's spaces. You mentioned women's sports is a particularly egregious version of that. I've never fully understand Title IX and was hoping that you might explain Title IX to me and whether that had a part to play in this election at all.
Title IX was an amendment to civil rights law to protect women in, I believe, sports and education. Or primarily education, and as a function of that, sports.
So back in the 60s?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the idea was that women should have, equal protections in these arenas. And what the Biden administration did was it expanded Title IX to include the rights of trans women, which to many women felt like a betrayal because it meant that, the very people they needed protection from were being welcomed in as the new oppressed group. Who they were going to have to take a second place to. And so, what of the protections of a young woman in a locker room having to be exposed to the genitalia of, a biologically male trans female athlete? What of the protections of a young woman volleyball player not being spiked in the face by somebody with enormous amounts of testosterone? Again, I think for it is infuriating. I mean, it's objectively infuriating And I think if you are a working class family and you have a child who's an athlete, like maybe this is very salient issue to you. But I do think that this is an issue that is much more upsetting to the elites conceptually than it is to people who are just really struggling. I mean, the reason it's so offensive is because like trans athletes were being awarded the kinds of benefits, paths out of poverty, paths out of, the way that sports is for many families in America, a path to success for talented children. A lot of those women were displaced from what would have been rightfully theirs by trans athletes. And that's very infuriating. And honestly, I think, if you look at the sports where they do this the most, it does seem to be sports that are not dominated by racial minorities. And I think that was probably intentional. I mean, I don't want to get conspiratorial here, but I've always noticed that like they do seem to be sort of this happens more in sports that are dominated by white young women, I think because they feel that on the left they have less sympathy. But I think people feel infuriated by this, but are just too, it's not, Americans vote on their pocketbooks.
So on demographics, we talked about the gender split. You are, I don't know that you voted, but you're making the case for Trump. You seem to be.
I did vote for Trump. I endorsed him a week before. I shocked myself, but a lot of people were like, we weren't shocked.
You shocked yourself?
I did, yeah.
Because you had previously not supported him?
Because I didn't think it was my place as a journalist to take a side in that way for a long time. I was undecided for a while. When Kamala Harris came out, I wanted to give her a chance to hear what she had to say.
Ooh, that turned out to be painful.
And then when I became convinced that I was going to vote for Trump, I thought to myself, well, what would be the better move as a journalist? How can I have more impact? Would it be to say, to keep that to myself, or would it be to talk about it? And I just felt that I couldn't stay on the sidelines anymore. My love for this country and my feeling that I had an obligation to be honest with my followers and people listening to me, that I had made up my mind about who I was going to vote for, that was really important. And so I shocked myself, and I made a video about why Jews, specifically American Jews, should see in Donald Trump the inheritor of our leftism, which has been an inherent part of the Jewish American identity for 100 years, and why he was the real legacy of the labor left and even the civil rights movement.
Because he's, unlike the Democrats who are illiberal, he actually stands for liberal meritocracy. What would be the argument?
No, because he's a populist who only cares about the working class and raising all boats. And he really loves this country, and he really loves the working class.
He's a patriot, yeah, okay.
Yeah, and the working class they love us as Jews. All of the anti-Semitism is coming from the elites, and the American working class is the ones having our backs, and we should stand with them. Like, it would be a shanda for Jews to vote against who the working class has chosen as their champion.
Well, Batya, yeah. I'm afraid to tell you that you didn't manage to convince the Jews of America. You are one of 21% of American Jews who feel the way you did. 79%, according to at least one exit poll, of American Jews voted for Harris. What do you make of that?
So I think when the real numbers come out, it'll be probably closer to like 65-35, which is what we saw last time.
Right.
I know that I did manage to convince 5 swing voters reached out to me and told me that they saw my video and they came off the fence and were going to vote for Trump. But 5, versus, it's like millions of us.
So why do the Jews not like? Why do they not like Trump, or is it that they like Harris?
So this is a question I get asked a lot when I travel, especially by working class people. Christians will come to me with like pain in their eyes. They really hate Democrats, but they love the Jews so much that even for Jewish Democrats, they just feel enormous amounts of pity, and they really want to understand this. Like, how could Jews be so overrepresented in the Democratic Party? And I think the answer is very simple. The divide in America is the class divide, and American Jews are unbelievably overrepresented in the college educated. 60% of Americans have American Jews have a college education, as opposed to just 30% of Americans. Yeah. And universities are woke mind virus factories. And so if you go to a university, it's very hard to come out. If you're a woman, especially, women come out of university either left or very left. Men, it's a little bit lower, but that indoctrination runs very, very deep. And the connection with the Democratic Party is very, I mean, that's why that's why Obama defunded vocational training and decided we're going to send everybody to college, because they come out Democrats. And I think that that's really the number one reason that so many American Jews have bought the Kool-Aid on the
even
Democrat
after
Party.
October 7th?
Yeah.
And even after the Abraham Accords. I can't tell. The Abraham Accords such obviously phenomenally good for peace in the Middle East, even as much as it seems that American Muslims understood. I mean, American Muslim support went up for Trump. According to the Council of American Islamic Relations, less than 50% supported Harris, and that's even the Trump who the mainstream media pummeled the famous lie about the Muslim ban back in 2017. So it's very peculiar to me that even Muslims appreciate Trump. And the Abraham Accords, I mean, we could probably talk about that, but here we have peace deals between Muslim-majority countries and Israel, trade deals. It's just unbelievably encouraging. There was no real conflict at all when Trump was last in office in Israel. Do American Jews see that and think, yeah, but that's so what? Or is it that they don't care as much about Israel? Is it that they disagree with it?
So only 4% of Americans vote on foreign policy. So they're not voting on foreign policy. But it's funny because I have a friend who lives in Kenosha. He's a Palestinian Uber driver. And he texted me that he voted for Trump because he wants to go visit his kids in Ramallah, and he knows Trump will end the war soon. And he's like, we don't want Biden's leftovers. And it's just so amazing to me that Palestinians were able to get there and American Jews were not able to get there. It's very you're reading these numbers out and I'm just feeling like such secondhand shame. The thing you have to understand about American Jews is, so the Orthodox community, I'm Orthodox. I think the numbers for the Orthodox community are going to be over 95% voting for Trump. And there is this feeling within the community, we don't like to air our dirty laundry in public, but if you're a progressive Jew, and you're not observant, and you've gone to university and everyone in your friend group is now an anti-Zionist and is constantly, retweeting these, anti-Zionist voices and how there's a genocide and blah, blah, blah. Like, what is really your connection to being Jewish? It's your Jewish history. But is it your what is the Jewish future for you? It's not like you're not experiencing the world through the lens of being a person who is, fundamentally identified with the future of this nation and the ways in which that is, inherently tied to the future of America, which I think it is. Would you go
further and say that American university educated Jews are becoming anti-Zionist? Would that be a stretch?
Certainly the younger ones, yeah. And the reason for that is very simple. So in 2015, when sociologists started studying the Great Awakening, they found that white liberals were getting more extreme in their views on race than Hispanics and blacks. They would say things that were just like, the much higher percentage, much more likely to have these very extreme views on race, like, that people of color have no agency and no ability to raise themselves up, and white people are uniquely evil. And one of the things they found is every single group has more positive in-group feeling than they do out-group feeling. So every group, whether it's like blacks, Hispanics, American conservatives, every group prefers themselves, their group first, more than they prefer others, except one group. And it's white liberals. So white liberals prefer every other group to themselves. Like, they literally measured this kind of guilt formation, this psychological obsession, in polls started in 2015. And if you are a Jew, a progressive Jew who identifies as white, who has a college education, you're much more likely to have that exact same, psychological formation where you sort of have a negative in-group feeling and a much more positive feeling towards every other group. And of course, in the case of Israel, that would include Palestinians. I think that there's that's a big unreported factor going on here.
As you speak, I think of identity politics, a term that's not really used. It's kind of dropped out of the zeitgeist, but that came from white liberals. And I suppose even though you say other groups are more instinctually identitarian, maybe, or it's actually that identity politics, which came from white liberals, was more about hatred of themselves.
Definitely, yeah. I wouldn't even call it identitarian. You're supposed to like yourself, your family, your neighborhood, your tribe, your people. Like, you're supposed to like them more than other people. Like, that is a moral imperative that's like built into our DNA.
Yes, but doesn't that get complicated when it becomes racial groups within America?
I don't know. Does it? I think I think it's okay
because my
to
community,
say,
when I'm either in London or in New York, it's completely mixed. It's not about I don't have a preference for different race groups. My preference is my community.
Right.
Yes, absolutely. My community includes every race under the sun.
I think most Americans feel that way. But if, if you're, a black person living in a black community and a pollster reaches out to you and says, of these 4 groups, which is your favorite? And you say black people, I don't know. That's like, that's the beauty of America is like we can, I as an American Jew can feel very connected to my community and still feel completely identified with America and be completely in love with this country as I am. And like, people can have pride in their community and in who they are, and that not be actually mean you have like a negative association with anybody else.
Are you concerned then about the Jewish community in America?
Yeah, very.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think happens next? What is there's very prominent.
You realize I'm going to get in so much trouble for this conversation.
It's very interesting. What happens next to, for example, Bill Ackman's a very prominent man who, after October 7th, has come out this morning, at time of recording, obviously, tweeted out that he's going to be removing one of his businesses from the Amsterdam Stock Exchange because of events he's seeing in Amsterdam, this pogrom that's been going on around a football game. So there are prominent Jews who are speaking out about this, but the majority still don't seem to see the world the same way.
I would be happy if they were like anti-Zionist American patriots. Like, I don't need them to feel a certain type of way about Israel. I need them to feel a certain type of way about America. I don't accept that it is okay with our history in this country where George Washington said every Jew will be treated as an equal. We are literally the promise of a liberal democracy fulfilled, that you can be a racial minority and be treated not just as equal, but as cherished. To turn on this country in the way that the left has, the anti-Zionism is only a reflection of anti-American sentiment. They hate Israel because they hate America, because they hate strength and they hate power. They hate beauty and they hate love.
That's why they hate the patriarchy and they hate men.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I just think, I don't need people to vote on Israel. I don't need people to vote on anti-Semitism. I need you to love your country. Like that is unacceptable to me, especially with our inheritance and our history here. And so that's the thing that I am most exercised about. When I meet Palestinians or Muslims who are anti-Zionist and really love America and feel really passionately about this country. My friend Nina Turner, I don't agree with anything she says about the Middle East, and I love her. And I think that she and I exist in a collective in this country I wouldn't want this country without her. She's unbelievably precious to me, and not just because she makes me think hard about, the Middle East and what have you, but because she loves this country. And so I just think that that's the most important thing. And even some of the American Jews who do get it about the anti-Semitism, I see Israel in a similar way to the way they do, but I don't see them like being madly zealous about protecting this country in the way that I would have them be. Like, I think the role of Zionism today should be to teach us how to love our country. Look how much they love their country.
Yeah.
Look how much we all are willing to stake for the existence of Israel. Are we really willing to do that for America? We have to be. We absolutely have to be. And I just feel that because America is not under threat or hasn't been under threat, a lot of us take for granted the beauties of this democracy, the amazing nature of this country and the fellowship here, the First Amendment. My God, like this is the greatest country on earth. And I just don't feel that I have many partners left on the left who are willing to say, we're going to stake everything for this place. This is our home. We're going to go down with this ship, and we're just not going to let that happen.
Paradoxical to this argument is what we were talking about earlier about Ukraine, because a lot of these people would argue we must protect Ukrainian sovereignty.
No kidding.
So there's a weird change there, difference there. I've got to ask you about the mainstream media's behavior through this election, because you wrote a fantastic book about it. Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. It seems like the mainstream media has not just... I saw a poll last week, I think it's a Gallup poll, that amongst Republicans, the trust in mainstream media, mass media, has dropped to about 12%. Yeah. But even amongst Democrats, it's down to about 52%. So the mainstream media is dying. What was your take of their behavior through this election? Did they see their ways and try to present things fairly, or was it worse than ever?
It's so funny because at some point Brian Stelter tweeted, I don't know if this was his words or if he was quoting an article.
Who's Brian Stelter?
He's a media analyst at CNN.
Okay.
He tweeted a quote, something like, if Donald Trump wins, this was a week ago, 2 weeks ago, if Donald Trump wins, the mainstream media will completely lose any remaining credibility that it has. There's going to be a huge reckoning, blah, blah, blah. And I kind of wanted to retweet it and say, listen, don't threaten me with a good time. I'm already voting for the guy, But that's basically what happened. I mean, they just beclowned themselves. I mean, let's start with just the mass cover up of Joe Biden's state of mind by the only people who had access to him, who lied and lied and lied about it. And then when the dam broke, because the oligarchs, because the Obamas and George Clooney and Nancy Pelosi decided he can't win now, because all of Americans had seen with their own eyes during that debate between Biden and Trump what the situation was. Suddenly the media was unbelievably cruel to Biden, just mocking and cruel and pointing out everything that they themselves had covered up, as if they were somehow being so brave, stunning and brave for doing this. And then Kamala Harris coming out, and then just this, the amazing effort that was put in to create some sort of collective amnesia and convince Americans no, you don't know this woman who ran for president 5 years ago and failed to get a single vote. You've never met her before. Let us introduce you to this amazing inheritor of Shirley Chisholm. I mean, God, what an insult to American history. And every week trying to find another thing to attack on Trump, another made up lie, the examples are just too numerous to count. But the argument that I made in Bad News, which came out 3 years ago, was that the reason that the media is like this is not because they are left. They actually aren't very left on labor issues. They are actually very invested in their own economic success. The reason that the media is so terrible, the reason it's woke, is because it is made up of elites. Now, the vast majority of journalists in America have a degree, many of them from a very elite institution. The majority have a graduate degree. So they represent less than 10% of Americans. They make good money, or they come from money. So the average starting salary of a first-year journalist, who has to live, by the way, in Los Angeles, Seattle, New York, or Washington, is, $40,000 a year. So you can't actually afford to live like that. That means their parents are paying their rent, right? Mm-hmm. So these are people who don't know a single Republican. These are people who don't know a single working class person. 75% of journalists in 2016 lived not just in blue cities and states, but in counties that went for Hillary Clinton by 20 points or more. So we're talking about just a total ensconcing in this little bubble, and people who apparently never even talk to their drivers or their cleaning ladies or the crew on the sets of their TV shows, who are all, from Staten Island,
quite.
Trump voters, right?
Quite.
So, basically they've just become part of the elites. And so their economic interests are with the elites.
Yeah.
They live in very rich neighborhoods. Their kids go to school with billionaires and politicians. They have gone from being outside of power, demanding justice on behalf of the little guy, to on the side of power. And that is why they hated Donald Trump, because he has a genius for exposing the basest qualities of his enemies. And so when he did the McDonald's stunt, and you saw the media just frothing at the mouth because he exposed their own contempt for the American working class, the multiracial, multi-ethnic American working class, the most tolerant, moderate, hardworking people in human history. And they have so much contempt for them. And that's who he represents. He is the tribune of the plebs.
There was perhaps the most... it was comical how ridiculous it was. Of all of these commentators is Joy Reid, who, as well as almost every day, if not every week, calling Trump literally Hitler,
Yeah.
she did a piece where she described this as she compared him to Mussolini, pre-Mandela South Africa, Hitler, all of the most evil, Putin, all of the most evil right-wing totalitarian regimes one can imagine. And she even said Florida was currently a fascist state. Now, I've just come back from Florida. It's glorious. I'm very strongly anti-fascist. It seems that she's conflating conservatism with fascism. What's curious to me is, why weren't these lessons learned in 2016? Because...
Yeah.
It was apparent then, we the media class have no idea what regular people think. We didn't see this coming at all. Why are they still surprised? That was 8 years ago.
They won in 2020, so I think they felt like there had been a course correction. They pulled it off. We don't have to learn those lessons, none of that. The real divide is, blacks versus whites and whatever, back to the old paradigm. But also, I think more fundamentally, and I talk a lot about this in Bad News, the business model for journalism today very much rewards left-wing excess. So journalists are far left on identity stuff. They're very radical in that sense because they go to elite universities, which are woke mind virus factories. But if the business model did not reward calling half the country racist, toxic, etc., their bosses would tell them, knock that off, And the reason the bosses don't tell them to knock it off is because success in journalism today is measured in terms of engagement, and the most angry readers are the most engaged. And you look at like the New York Times, and they want specifically rich progressive readers, right? So these are people who have no real problems, but they still want to feel like they're on the right side of history, which is where wokeness comes from. It allowed them to mask the fact that they had become rich while also allowing them to still see themselves as, the mighty justice warriors against evil by hyper-focusing on gender and race instead of on the class divide that they had very much benefited from. Mm-hmm. So that is the business model just completely rewards calling him a white supremacist every day, because that gets the New York Times reader really worked up, which gets the New York Times money because they're more engaged, they're more likely to click on an ad, they stay on site longer so they can sell their third-party data. So the whole business model was around digital media was recreated to reward the worst impulses of these over-credentialed college elites who now make up American newsrooms.
Yeah, I mean, did you see Jimmy Kimmel crying on his late night show monologue? I mean, he might be crying because the Department of Defense Chief of Staff, Trump's Department of Defense Chief of Staff, Kash Patel, has said that he wants to release the Diddy tapes, or it might be because Jimmy Kimmel learned that actually most Americans don't care what he thinks and voted completely differently. I'm just so disappointed at this time that there's some reflection and thinking, well, let's go and find out what our fellow Americans think. Is there a possibility of reconciliation between this this cleaved America, one that you say is cleaved amongst class lines. It's this elite, and then there's the working people.
Well, the divide is 100% among the elites. So, I don't really care if they learn their lesson or not because they've made themselves irrelevant. I don't care if Jimmy Kimmel ever realizes he's wrong. I don't care that, I don't know what vanishing number of Americans watch that show and get off on it and get off on this beta male like weeping that, he's I don't think it matters anymore because it's obvious that Trump has a mandate. It's obvious that he's made off with a huge portion of people who used to be Democratic voters. It's obvious that rich people are now Democrats and working class people are now Republicans, or at least part of the MAGA movement. So I don't know that we need a reconciliation. It's already happened because polarization was always a myth. It was always an elite phenomenon. So if the elites learn the lesson, I don't care. They can keep being irrelevant because they have no impact anymore. Like they've lost their ability to influence. That's kind of what the Stelter tweet was saying. Like they've lost the ability to tell the American people what to think, and that is a wonderful thing.
Yeah. So a lot of this conversation, it's been about a defense of MAGA policy and an exploration into MAGA policy, which I would say has been largely positive, and you seem optimistic. But if you had to criticize Trumpism, if there was one aspect that you're concerned about, or maybe several aspects that you're concerned about, now that he has this unbelievable mandate, what would those be?
Well, I'm worried about the business community influencing the agenda. There's going to be a push and pull there. But maybe that's good, like maybe it's good for there to be kind of a compromise. I'm worried about RFK being given a lot of power on the healthcare front.
Why is that? Because
we need real healthcare reform. And I think that his views are a bit niche. I'm glad he was brought on because it proved what I was saying, which was that Trump was running a unity campaign. I think it's really noble that he joined the Trump movement and the campaign. I love that Tulsi was there. I think this is great stuff, but we need real healthcare reform. So I'm worried about that. I'm worried about the media misreporting things to an extent that it gets in the way of Trump's ability to be the person that I think we want him to be.
So that's not really a worry about Trump.
Right.
It's about how he's going to be represented.
I want him to speak in a way that reflects what his actual accomplishments, which is that he is actually a uniter and not a divider. And I want him to get past the need to stick it to the elites. Like I want him, and I don't know that he can do this, but I want him to see his victory as the ultimate, middle finger. And so he can sort of take down the rhetoric and speak as a uniter, as the president of all Americans. That's what I'm hoping for.
Okay. Well, I guess we've covered so much. There's one last thing that I'm quite excited about that I'd love to ask you about, which is that Elon Musk, who's part of that unity team that's been brought in, has just said he wants to shrink the government by 2/3 to 1/3 its size. Famously, he did something similar at Twitter, sacking 80% of staff. Is this something to be excited about? Is this the American dream of small government once again? That's going to obviously increase unemployment because there's millions of people employed by the government. Is this something you're excited about?
When I look at Argentina and I look at how Milei was able to bring down inflation by double digits, allegedly by firing a lot of people in government. I mean, that seems to be the major way that he did that. That makes me feel like this is a good idea. But I also, as somebody who recently had my Twitter account hacked and found it very difficult to get it back.
What happened? Do you know?
Well, they've been coming after a lot of influencers. So
it was just in the election?
Yeah, it was like a week before the election.
No way.
So very...
How suspicious.
Terrifying.
Yeah.
But it was not easy to find the people who could help. And so I worry a little bit from that point of view. The thing that I found most interesting about Elon Musk being such a champion and cheerleader of Trump was he's very close with the Chinese Communist Party. His entire supply chain for Tesla is in China.
So he's compromised.
No, well, I thought it was very interesting that China wanted to have this avenue, potentially. It's hard for me to imagine that he would have been able to do this without some kind of negotiation with the CCP, because they control so much of his businesses. So it seemed interesting to me that they wanted to have some sort of avenue to the Trump administration, I guess, in the future if Trump should win. So that's kind of what I'll be paying attention to, I think. And yeah, but obviously there's a lot of government waste. And this is something that people told me about a lot when I was reporting my book. Like they just felt like they all knew people who were scamming the system. There's a lot of welfare fraud that they knew about firsthand. And they felt like very dispirited by the idea that government seemed to be not working for them. So, as long as there's somebody keeping an eye on what he's slashing and what he isn't.
Batya Ungar-Sargon, thank you so much for speaking with me. You seem elated by the election results. I hope things go as well as you seem to want them to go. It seems like an exciting time to be in America and to be an American, at least for half of you. Thank you so much for your time. Where can, apart from reading your fantastic books, where can viewers and listeners find you? What are you excited about next?
Thank you so much for having me. God bless you and the work that you do. I'm on Twitter, although I think I need to take a break. It's been quite a few weeks. I'm on Instagram. I'm doing a show with the Free Press, and I'm the opinion editor at Newsweek. So you can see our work there as well.
Wonderful. Batya Ungar-Sargon, a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching The Winston Marshall Show. That was Batya Ungar-Sargon. If you want to support the show, I remind you, all you have to do is press like and subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Batya, exploring the issues that you want to hear about. But until next time, be well.